Let's take a short journey through time and look at the 33 climate predictions which turned out to be wrong. Let's begin our journey in October of 1958. That was when the New York Times published an article in which they wrote this, quote, "Some scientists estimate that the polar ice pack is 40% thinner and 12% less in area than it was a half century ago, and that even within the lifetime of our children, the Arctic Ocean may open, enabling ships to sail over the North Pole." Then we can fast forward to November of 1967, and here's what the Salt Lake City Tribune reported on the issue of the coming famine. Quote, "It is already too late for the world to avoid a long period of famine." Now, this article was citing the work of Mr. Paul Ehrlich, who was a Stanford University biologist, and his prediction was that by the year 1975, there will be global famines due to overpopulation, the coming ice age. For instance, in April of 1970, here is what the Boston Globe reported, quote, "Scientists predict a new ice age by the 21st century. Citing a pollution expert named James Lodge, the Boston Globe continued by writing this, quote, "Air pollution may obliterate the sun and cause a new ice age in the first third of the new century." And these predictions of a coming ice age just continued to roll on. In July of 1971, a report in the Washington Post, this time citing a NASA scientist, it wrote this, quote, "The world could be as little as 50 or 60 years away from a disastrous new ice age." Which is funny, given the fact that 50 years from 1971 is pretty much exactly today. Then, in December of 1972, you had two geologists from Brown University who wrote a highly publicized letter to President Nixon, saying that, quote, "A conference attended by 42 top American and European investigators concluded a global deterioration of climate by order of magnitude larger than any hitherto experienced by civilized mankind is a very real possibility and indeed may be due very soon. The present rate of cooling seems fast enough to bring glacial temperatures in about a century, if continuing at the present pace." Then you fast forward about a year and a half to January of 1974, and here was what was written in the Guardian newspaper, quote, "Space satellites show new ice age coming fast." Then 5 months later, in June of 1974, a story in Time magazine, well, it asked a very similar question, quote, "Another ice age? Telltale signs are everywhere, from the unexpected persistence and thickness of pack ice in the waters around Iceland to the southward migration of a warmth-loving creature like the armadillo from the Midwest." And this trend of predicting a coming ice age continued for the next 4 years. For instance, in January of 1978, here is what was written in the New York Times, quote, "An international team of specialists has concluded from 8 indexes of climate that there is no end in sight to the cooling trend of the last 30 years, at least in the Northern Hemisphere." However, it appears that an end to the trend was in sight, because just a year later, that very same newspaper, meaning the New York Times, was reporting the exact opposite. Here's one of their stories from February of 1979, which is again a year from the previous one we just read. Quote, "There is a real possibility that some people now in their infancy will live to a time when the ice at the North Pole will have melted, a change that would cause swift and perhaps catastrophic changes in climate." Then, 3 years later, in May of 1982, the New York Times even gave a potential date for this coming collapse. In a story where they were citing the executive director of the United Nations Environmental Program, here's what they wrote, quote, "If the world didn't change course, it would face an environmental catastrophe which will witness devastation as complete, as irreversible as any nuclear holocaust by the year 2000. There were other predictions which came and went as well. For instance, in September of 1988, there was a report in AFP which said that the island nation of the Maldives was at risk of becoming completely covered by a, quote, "gradual rise in average sea level in 30 years, and that the end of the Maldives and its people could come sooner if drinking water supplies dry up by 1992, as predicted." And just for your reference, the Maldives are still not underwater, and instead, they're actually thriving and developing. In June of 1989, which by the way is the same month as the Tiananmen Square massacre, the San Jose Mercury News, they reported this, quote, "A senior environmental official at the United Nations, Noel Brown, says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if global warming is not reversed by the year 2000. Then we fast forward to the year 2000, and even though many of these earlier predictions didn't quite pan out, well, they were replaced by new predictions. For instance, in March of 2000, here was what an article in The Independent said about specifically the UK, quote, "Snowfalls are now just a thing of the past. Children just aren't going to know what snow is. Within a few years, winter snowfall would become a very rare and exciting event." For your reference, it still snows in the UK pretty much every winter, especially in the middle and northern part of the country. Regardless, let's fast forward another year to December of 2001, and here is what a story from the Albuquerque Journal said, quote, The changes in climate could potentially extirpate the sugar maple industry in New England within 20 years, according to George Hurt, co-author of a 2001 global warming report commissioned by the U.S. Congress. For your reference, 22 years after that report, and New England still produces plenty of maple syrup to this day. Then we fast forward another 3 years to February of 2004, where a story within the Guardian newspaper exposed, quote, a secret Pentagon report that predicted climate change will lead to nuclear war, major European cities will sink into the ocean, and Britain would descend into Siberian climate by the year 2020. And as we mentioned earlier, although it does still snow in Britain, by the year 2020, it was nothing like the climate of Siberia. Regardless, we fast forward another 2 years, and in January of 2006, the Associated Press, while paraphrasing Al Gore, they wrote this, quote, unless drastic measures to reduce greenhouse gases are taken within the next 10 years, the world will reach a point of no return. Then the following year, in November of 2007, the New York Times quoted the head of the United Nations Climate Panel, who said this, quote, this year was the defining moment of the climate change fight. If there is no action before 2012, that's too late. In that same month, Canada's CanWest News Service, while paraphrasing another polar researcher, they wrote this, quote, the Arctic Ocean could be free of ice in the summer, as soon as 2010 or 2015, something that hasn't happened in more than 1,000,000 years. And this Arctic Ocean without ice prediction began to gain traction. For instance, the next month, in December of 2007, here was a story in the Associated Press citing a NASA scientist, quote, Arctic sea ice gone in summer within 5 years? At this rate, the Arctic Ocean could be nearly ice-free at the end of summer by 2012. In that same month, by the way, the BBC, they had a slightly different prediction. Citing another climate expert, here's what the BBC wrote, quote, Arctic summers ice-free by 2013? Our prediction of 2013 for the removal of ice in the summer is not accounting for the last two minima in 2005 and 2007. So given that fact, you can argue that maybe our projection of 2013 is already too conservative. Then a few months later, in March of 2008, you had Xinhua, which is China's official propaganda mouthpiece, citing a Norwegian official who wrote this, quote, if Norway's average temperature this year equals that in 2007, the ice cap in the Arctic will all melt away, which is highly possible judging from current conditions. For your reference, Norway's average temperature did actually slightly increase from the year 2007 to the year 2008, but the ice did not melt. Regardless, a month later, in April of 2008, there was a report in New Scientist magazine which was citing the director of the National Snow and Ice Data Center, and they wrote this, quote, the North Pole could be ice-free in 2008. There is this thin first-year ice even at the North Pole at the moment. That raises the specter, the possibility that you could become ice-free at the North Pole this year. And these ice predictions just kept piling on. For instance, in June of 2008, you had the National Geographic News, it's a news outlet, citing an environmental scientist writing this, quote, we're actually projecting this year that the North Pole may be free of ice for the first time in history. In that same month, the Associated Press, paraphrasing a NASA scientist this time, wrote this, quote, in 5 to 10 years, the Arctic will be free of ice in the summer. Then, just a year later, you have probably one of the most famous predictions that have been made. USA Today, citing the former US Vice President, Mr. Al Gore, they wrote this, quote, the Arctic Ocean may be nearly ice-free in the summer as early as 2014. And again, these predictions just kept snowballing, no pun intended. In summer of 2012, the Australian wrote this, quote, enjoy snow now. By 2020, it'll be gone. In July of 2013, you had The Guardian, quote, ice-free Arctic in 2 years heralds methane catastrophe, says a scientist. Then in August of 2017, you had the Sydney Morning Herald, quote, snowy retreat, climate change puts Australia's ski industry on a downhill slope. We get to January of 2018, and this was when a Forbes article, citing a Harvard University professor, wrote this, quote, the chance that there will be any permanent ice left in the Arctic after the year 2022 is essentially zero. Then, in June of 2018, Ms. Greta Thunberg, the young climate activist, she shared a story on Twitter which was titled this, quote, top climate scientist says humans will go extinct if we don't fix climate change by 2023. To which Greta added this, quote, a top climate scientist is warning that climate change will wipe out all of humanity unless we stop using fossil fuels over the next 5 years. Now, for some odd reason, Greta decided to delete that particular tweet earlier this year. And she was not the only one that had to delete her earlier prediction. That's because in January of 2020, Glacier National Park had to remove one of their signs because that sign claimed that all the glaciers would be melted away by the year 2020, which would be an awkward thing to read in the year 2020 when you can still see the glacier in the background. Then, in December of 2021, the LA Times ran a story with this headline, quote, "A no-snow California could come sooner than you think." Interestingly enough, a few weeks after this article was published, researchers over at UC Berkeley announced that California actually had the snowiest December on record. Regardless though, a year later, in August of 2022, Bloomberg reported this, quote, "The end of snow threatens to upend 76 million American lives." However, it's worth noting that just a few months later, the Sierra Nevada mountains saw their second snowiest winter on record. And then of course, right now, right at this moment, California is getting blasted with a bomb cyclone with record levels of snow coming down quite literally as we speak.